The RCMP review into the 2022 mass stabbing attack in 2 Saskatchewan communities has been released. The review looked into the force's handling of a series of fatal stabbings at James Smith Cree Nation and Weldon and the arrest of the man responsible. I'm Dave Breckenridge and this is 10-3. Julia Peterson, a reporter with the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, joins me to discuss what the RCMP review found, what recommendations have been made, and whether this review, coupled with 2 coroner's inquests, gives the community closure. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Julia, we're going to be talking about the RCMP review into the tragedy that unfolded in fall 2022 in Weldon, Saskatchewan, the James Smith Cree Nation. Before we get into the findings of this review conducted by the RCMP, I guess walk us through what happened in September 2022 in these communities.
So early in the morning on September 4th, 2022, which was the Labor Day Monday, Miles Sanderson of James Smith Cree Nation fatally stabbed 11 people and injured 17 others across the communities of James Smith and the village of Weldon, Saskatchewan, which is nearby. After that, Miles Sanderson went to ground and wasn't caught until 3 days later after an extensive multi-provincial manhunt that culminated in a high-speed chase down the highway towards Saskatoon. He died shortly after being forced off the road in police custody.
And so just looking at the incidents there, ultimately, how many people were injured or killed? You said Miles Sanderson died in RCMP custody. Do we have a sense of what the motive for these attacks were?
One of the things that came out across the 2 coroner's inquests that took place earlier this year was, when it comes to question of motive, there's so much that is unknown and that we'll never know. Because Miles Sanderson died so soon after his arrest, there was certainly speculation. There were comments that Miles Sanderson himself made prior to and during some of the attacks that related to gang activity and drugs, although police and corrections officers and people who had been involved in that side of his life had not found any significant recent connection between Miles Sanderson and gangs. So there's a lot that, unfortunately, it is very hard to say why this and why these people and why now. For some, it was family, including the family of his ex-partner, and there was a significant domestic violence and intimate partner violence component here. For some, it seemed to be related to drugs and transactions related to drugs. And some people, tragically, were either killed as they were coming to help, trying to respond to the stabbings, like community support workers. And some, including Wes Peterson, the gentleman who was killed in Weldon, seemed simply to be a victim of opportunity.
Yeah. Now, as mentioned off the top, last week there was an RCMP review released into its handling of the incident. There were also, as you mentioned, 2 coroner's inquests into the deaths of the people in James Smith Cree Nation and Weldon, Saskatchewan, and also the death of Miles Sanderson in custody. And we will talk about those coroner's inquests a little later on, but to get to the more recent release, what was the RCMP looking into in its review? Was it its handling of the stabbings? Was it its handling of the arrest? The kind of the scope of everything? What was the main focus of this review?
The main focus of this review was how the RCMP responded to the attacks on the morning of September 4th and the subsequent manhunt. It was both an examination of its procedures and responses in this case, and to see whether the RCMP had learned from previous mass casualty incidents in Canada.
And what were some of the major findings of this review?
To me, what stood out as the most important finding, certainly the most critical, was that the RCMP, in its extensive and I found quite thorough report, did not find that there was some glaring flaw or missing link in the police response that morning that could have saved lives. To me, that stands out as the most essential finding because either way, it's an unfathomable tragedy. But to know that there wasn't something that got missed or something that was done incorrectly, where people could still have been alive today who weren't because of some of the response, that would just be so different than what the RCMP found to be the case in actuality, which was that, sure, they've got some things that they can tidy up and clean up, and also some things that they did well that they think that other jurisdictions can learn from in a quite positive sense. But a lot of these are smaller, procedural focused and not a key grounding moment in the response.
Yeah. So you say there were a number of things that potentially went right for the RCMP in its response, according to this review, and perhaps other police agencies can learn from. What were those things? What went right for the RCMP here?
Absolutely. So some of the things that the RCMP said went well and went right in the response was that they quickly established victim support roles as part of the response and had culturally appropriate resources integrated into this in key positions, that there was a priority on sharing accurate and relevant and updated information with the public, and that they had strong working relationships with other organizations, other law enforcement partners, other communities that they were able to draw on as this was ongoing. Some of the places where the RCMP found that after September 4th, they still had some work to do. And I do want to note that between then and now, the Saskatchewan RCMP has resolved or put some work into addressing some of these points, but they're still mentioned as areas for growth in the review. One has to do with building a stronger community relationship between the Melfort RCMP detachment, which was the closest RCMP detachment to James Smith Cree Nation, and the James Smith community itself. Another was creating a standard command structure for major events. Something that became clear in the review process was that in Saskatchewan at the time, there wasn't a specific command structure to follow for something of this scale and of this nature. So there were procedures being built on the fly. Another had to do with conducting different sorts of risk assessments for officers going into situations like this, whether they respond in one vehicle or two vehicles, whether it is the best decision for officers to split up to cover more ground or if they should stay together. And another quite important one was to improve the process for triaging high volumes of tip information. In the hours and days after the stabbing attacks, I cannot overemphasize how many tips from all over Canada and beyond the RCMP was receiving about where Miles Sanderson might potentially be. And in the aftermath, after Miles Sanderson had been found and he died in police custody, and after the dust had settled, they did find that there were 3 tips that actually did place him in the area where it was later found that he was hiding. But in this pile of hundreds from all over, it was very difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff here. And there were also some pretty important recommendations that came out about improving the coordination between the RCMP's emergency response on the ground and with the RCMP's aircraft and air support team. It was found that there wasn't a single person who was put in charge of coordinating that particular facet of the response. And of course, there were a million things going on in the moment, but because there was no one person put in charge of coordinating the air response and that communication with the critical incident commander on the ground, there were planes who were flying in inefficient ways, not knowing what they were supposed to be doing, planes going up with the wrong equipment, or not having planes available when they were actually needed as parts of the response. And I want to emphasize again, this isn't something that the RCMP said, if not for this, things would have been substantially different on September 4th or in the days afterwards. But it was something that they noted as a significant error in the response that they have since then done quite a lot of work to correct.
We'll be right back. Now we're talking about communities that have been through a pretty large tragedy, shook both communities to their core, and inquests and follow-up investigations. What's been the response from either Weldon, Saskatchewan, or the James Smith Cree Nation to this review, and the fact that while there were some areas of potential improvement, there were no major failings?
I think that after the coroner's inquests, which took place earlier this year, this review, from a community perspective, really does follow from what was said before. If there had been some kind of major failing, it is quite likely, almost certain, I would say, that would have come out in the inquest process and would have been felt and responded to by the communities at that time. Something that, as a reporter in the room, really struck me from the inquest process was that it did seem to bring a big measure of closure, of healing, and of a path forward for these community members. A moment that really stood out to me at the second coroner's inquest was after the testimony from RCMP Constable Heidi Marshall. She was one of the officers in pursuit in the high-speed chase that resulted in Miles Sanderson's arrest. And because she's not in one of the specialized RCMP units that generally does this sort of thing, she hadn't done training on the type of maneuver that involves driving one vehicle into another in pursuit at high speed to take them off the road. And the incident commander knew that the officers in pursuit were regular detachment officers who didn't have that training, but gave the order to take him off the road anyways. He was driving at incredibly high speed. He was often driving the wrong way down the highway. It was extremely dangerous. And she testified that there was a moment where she really sat with the thought that she was going to die that day. She was going to leave her kids without a mom. And then she put that thought to the back of her mind, focused on executing the order she'd been given. And at the end, she did it. All of the officers who spoke about it described her driving as textbook. And after her very emotional testimony, she was absolutely embraced by James Smith community members. They were hugging her in the hallway outside the inquest. Miles Sanderson's uncle, who serves as the head of security on James Smith Cree Nation, he made a point of inviting her to come to the First Nation whenever she is in the area, that she is always welcome there, and she will always be welcome with them on their shared journey of healing and moving forward. So moments like that, I think, were really important for these communities.
So as mentioned earlier, this review followed a pair of coroner's inquests, one into the deaths of the victims in James Smith Cree Nation and Weldon, the other into the death of Miles Sanderson in police custody. What were some of the main findings in both of these inquests?
So the first coroner's inquest into the victims of the attacks concluded with an extensive 29 recommendations, which addressed everyone from Correctional Service Canada, the RCMP, James Smith Cree Nation leadership, the Ministry of Public Safety. And they were talking about improving the RCMP's photo database, improving the emergency alert system, improving the health, wellness, and cultural programming available on James Smith Cree Nation, and the importance of having more support available for people leaving prison and reintegrating into the community. One of the recommendations that stood out to me was that the inquest jurors recommended the RCMP consider expanding its warrant enforcement and suppression team and crime reduction team in Saskatchewan. The RCMP in its response to that came with this review last week, said that they absolutely agree with that in principle, but that in practice, this is quite difficult to do because of persistent staffing issues that they have had. And as the RCMP emphasized in its response, to fill these specialized teams, it's not a matter of pulling new officers straight out of depot and throwing them onto the team. They're looking to staff these with extremely experienced people who have had years of field work behind them. So it's difficult when they're drawing from such a reduced bench. Another thing that came up out of the inquests was that when the warrant enforcement and suppression team does their work, they focus on people who are out on warrant and who are extremely dangerous. They have to prioritize quite ruthlessly because there's no way that they're going to be able to get to everybody who has an arrest warrant out for them. So they have to go for the most dangerous. One of the recommendations to come out of the inquest was that an offender's history of domestic violence and intimate partner violence be included in how the warrant enforcement and suppression team calculates how dangerous an offender is. The RCMP, in its response to that, said, this is another one they agree with in principle, but to add that to the calculation would be extremely labor intensive and would require a pretty significant restructuring of the way they do this math. There are ways that they're trying to implement this now, adding a flag to a person's file, making a note of it. But they have noted that to actually implement this will take a huge amount of work.
So what was the nature of the domestic violence aspect of this incident that led to that recommendation?
So Miles Sanderson had an extensive history of domestic violence, especially against his ex-partner, Vanessa Burns. And in her testimony at the first coroner's inquest, she spoke about how she had been absolutely terrified. And some of the psychologists and officers who testified later affirmed terrified for good reason, that had Miles Sanderson made it back to Saskatoon, which was where Vanessa had fled to after leaving the First Nation just before the attacks, that he was going to come after her and come after their kids. And in fact, multiple members of Vanessa's family were injured or killed in the attacks.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else from those inquest reports that caught your attention? And I guess you already mentioned that the RCMP in its review agreed with some of these ideas in principle. Was there any other overlap between these two coroners' inquests and the RCMP review?
Absolutely. One of the moments from the coroner's inquest, especially the first inquest, that I thought was absolutely vital was testimony from the paramedics and the first responders, who affirmed that the people who died that day, they died very quickly, that there would not have been a chance to save their lives, even if ambulances had got there 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes quicker. That the nature of these injuries was so significant. The one exception to that was Miles Sanderson's brother, who was the first victim of the attacks, where it was more difficult to determine how quickly or how slowly he had died. But the inquest also showed photos of where he had died off the side of the road on James Smith Cree Nation in a place that was quite hidden and difficult to find, certainly difficult to see from the road. And that, I know, had an impact on community members to know that this wasn't something that had been a missing link. And this wasn't something that, if people had only got here a little bit quicker, that their loved ones might have survived that day. These were really catastrophic injuries. Another thing that stood out to me was how many of the recommendations from those inquests, and even lessons learned I would say, before the inquest process began, have already been put in place, or the groundwork is being done to put them in place by the RCMP, by police forces, by local communities. That there has been a massive concerted and I would say quite collaborative effort to learn from what happened, both to hopefully prevent anything like this from happening again, but also to improve all of the various gaps that were found or were really thrown into stark relief in that moment. And I come back to something that Daryl Burns, the brother of Lydia Gloria Burns, who was a community support worker on James Smith, who was killed on September 4th as she was acting as a first responder, trying to save somebody's life after he had been injured. And what Daryl Burns said was, if my sister's death means that something positive is going to come out of this, then her legacy is going to live on. And what I've seen in the weeks and months and all of the work that has followed from this is that there is a really big effort to make sure that these deaths aren't just a tragedy, that lessons do get learned.
Is there any sense in Weldon or at James Smith Cree Nation that any of these reports bring closure or help them to move on now?
I would say so, yes. From what I've seen, there has been a sense that now all of this is out in the open. Now that any of those really painful open questions have been put to bed as best they can be, that there is an ability to move forward. Right near the conclusion of the first inquest, which had to do with the victims on James Smith and in Weldon, after, I would say, most of the very difficult and emotional testimony had concluded, and a lot of the open questions about could lives have been saved with a faster response time, or was there a huge glaring error that went wrong in any of these moments in the response. Once those had been put to bed, I was out on the James Smith community for a round dance that had been organized to celebrate the strength and the resilience of the community. And in that moment, with all of these families in the school gym, all of these kids enthusiastically dancing in the circle, wellness support workers who had been working so hard throughout these weeks of the inquest, taking off their support worker vest for the night and being able to just exist in this community space, it really did seem as though the grief is still there and profound and transformative. But there is also now more of an ability to move forward.
Well, it's certainly been an important story, important follow-ups to community tragedy. Julia, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Dave, very much.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest Julia Peterson. More from them at thestarphoenix.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.